Hey, everybody, welcome back to the show. Like I said in the introduction, I'm here with Eric Neal at Digital Power Optimization. Eric, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ben. Although we're off to a bit of a rocky start.
Uh-oh, we're
You
off
you,
to a
ti
rocky
you
start
yeah,
already.
you titled this hash rate happy hour, and I currently have zero old fashioned sitting in front of me, so I'll let it pass this one time. But next invite, I expect something cold in front of me.
Eric, I'm glad that you actually brought that up. So I've recorded several episodes. This is a very new podcast, and I have recorded several episodes now. You are the first one to actually ask and or call that out. Yeah, the show is Hash Rate Happy Hour. What I find typically with my guest is that middle of the day tends to work the best for everyone in their busy lives, and it's hard to get a beer in at for me it's 1:45 in the afternoon. So
Well,
yes,
we'll make that
next
work pretty
invite.
soon. All right,
Yeah, next invite will be with a beer in hand, I promise.
sounds good.
I do appreciate that. I'm happy that somebody takes the time to kind of pay attention to the show
Well, I've been
title.
trying to catch up on some of your prior episodes over my actual happy hours, so it's serving its
Oh,
purpose, I think.
that's very flattering. Thank you. All right, so Eric, I think what's going to help us set the foundation for the rest of our conversation and discussion today, I'd love for you to go through your background and touch on the experience and just the depth of knowledge you have in the electric and the utility side of the Bitcoin mining and energy discussion. So please give us a walk through your background.
Sure. So instead of listing roles and responsibilities like a resume, I'm going to try and take you on a bit of a journey through the career that I've had and touch on some of the key things I learned along the way that really helped me appreciate why this technology is so unique and exciting for energy companies, and also shed some light on why it isn't being deployed as rapidly as you and I think it probably should be. So
Awesome.
I'll start from the beginning. I was brought into the utility space as an engineer, specifically as a thermal performance engineer. And that was an awesome way to get a ton of information very quickly because thermal engineers, you have to spend some time out in the plant. You're interacting with a ton of data. You're putting energy market offer strategies together to try and optimize a resource. You are paying attention to capital requests. So interactions with a whole bunch of different areas of the business with the specific piece of um, experience carrying forward into this discussion is developing those energy market offer strategies and understanding what it takes for a resource to have an impact on the grid and that whole process of an energy market desk, putting that into an ISO offer and having that offer clear and augmenting your day ahead and real time operations of your plant in response to what's going on in the market. That was great visibility that helps me appreciate what this technology can do. So fast forward 3 to 4 years, and the company that I was working for realized I was pretty good at building models to justify large capital projects, and had a bit of a knack, I guess, for translating that information to the folks on the finance side of the business. So they sent me to night school to get an MBA, and I spent a bit of time in a role they called it a planning engineer, which was really an interface between engineering and finance.
Okay.
And that worked pretty well to help. Well, I mean, let's take a moment there. Most people in finance, they speak in terms of dollars and cents, right? It's CapEx and
Yes.
OpEx.
Yep.
And when you're having a conversation with someone who's trying to convince you to, organize your budget by talking about BTUs and kilopounds per hour, it's like there's a communication gap. So that planning role, my primary function there was build some interface that allows all these engineering pieces to come in, and it churns a bunch of numbers and spits out dollars and cents, right? In a way that is vetted and well understood and accepted as a good way to process engineering to advertise how we spend. So that was a great experience. Um, I came out of that role and was asked to move into what they call integrated resource planning. which if you have a member of your audience or members in the utility space, they probably are very familiar with that term. And it really is just a fancy title for a much more macro level way of looking at the entire portfolio. The regulated utilities want to build something large, they have to go justify it to the regulators. And the integrated resource plan is
Yeah.
kind of that economic modeling foundation for that financial conversation to take place around, do you need this? And is this the best solution for your customers? Over the course of shepherding about 5 projects through the regulatory process, fortunately, 5 successful projects, it really opened my eyes to a different area of the business and helped me understand just how political of a process it is to get projects approved to spend utility money. And each project is a little different, but you have a common cast of characters. It's industrial stakeholder groups, residential consumer advocacy groups, you have environmental stakeholders, you have to satisfy your investors, you have local landowners that are going to come out and speak if something isn't quite right. And
Sure.
it is an orchestra of very capable individuals to move a project through that process. And what you're trying to do is balance the interests of everybody that you expect to get involved and find some common ground that hopefully keeps them on the sidelines when you file your application. But that doesn't always happen. I'd say probably more times than not, it doesn't happen. And there's at least one stakeholder that's going to, they call it intervening in your docket, that's going to intervene. And they usually will absolutely devour you over any piece of information that's out of place, any assumption they don't agree with. And you put your best people forward, and hopefully you have a really good story. You have a great project. You're well prepared. And you come out of that process, maybe with some compromise, maybe not. But you come out of that. That should really help us understand why utilities don't move as quickly on new opportunities as we might think they should move.
That's a phenomenal perspective. Yeah. Oh, that's great.
Well, in some cases, you don't know how those stakeholders are going to react to something until you put it in front of them. So you'll see quite commonly, utilities will do things, they'll call it either a pilot or a demonstration, but it's some limited scale that mitigates, downside risk across those stakeholder groups. So that, hey, we think this is a good idea. We don't know how our stakeholders are going to respond, so we're going to do it on a small scale at first. And after we go through that process, we learn a tremendous amount about how people are going to react to it, how the numbers are going to be handled, whether or not we come out of that regulatory process with the outcome that we were expecting, and so on and so forth. And once you get through, or once some other utility gets through that process with a new idea or a new concept, it kind of sets that foundation, a bit of a precedent, if you will,
Sure.
to deploy it at a larger scale across the portfolio. Time spent in the utility. And now we're probably a little over a decade into my career, and that's when I started wearing a bunch of different hats. I participated on some strategic planning teams, which really was, get innovative on how we might want to transform the business over the next 5, 10, 20 years. What's up and coming that's going to influence our industry. Economic development, I spent time with doing some technical and economic assessment of people coming and asking for large volumes of energy. Spent some time in project development, which is a role that encompasses preliminary engineering and procurement activities and environmental reviews to pull that regulatory application together and eventually bid out a project. A little bit of time in rate design and a host of other hats here and there, until eventually I found myself across the table from DPO. And
Okay.
DPO, digital power optimization.
Yeah.
And I was on an economic development call where they were pitching their business model. And fast forward a year, and I'm sitting here with you today as a member of that team, because about 15 minutes, probably wasn't even that, it was probably 5 minutes in to listening to DPO talk, I said to myself, I'm hooked. I'm absolutely hooked. This is the best energy management technology that's come across my desk since I started working here. This is awesome. And well, here we are.
So I have to ask, Before you jumped to the other side of the table to be sitting with DPO, did you internally try to get your company that you were working for to do that themselves or implement a Bitcoin mining strategy? Or did you try internally before you went to the DPO side of the table?
There was a very brief period of time. So the DPO actually came into the organization that I was working for through another individual, and I was brought in later in those discussions. So there was a period of time where I was supporting an assessment, but it hadn't really clicked for me yet. And it must have been the second call I was on. Maybe it was the first. I think it was the second call I was on with DPO's founders. And the bells started ringing and everything clicked. And after the call was over, I got out my cell phone. I gave them a call and I said, "Guys, this is genius. Like I want to help you do this. I want to be on your team." And it was, the timing was right because they had just completed a Series A funding raise and they were in the process of building out their team. And one of the team members they were interested in bringing on was somebody with a wealth of experience in the industry from the utility side of things.
Sure.
And I just happened to call at the right time. And fortunately, they liked what I had to say. And here we are.
So and I guess maybe just to clarify what I was getting at by asking you that is, I am also coming from corporate America where I got bit by the Bitcoin mining bug and you just can't let it go, kind of a thing. You think about all the ways it's helping and moving the ball forward in terms of whether you need to expand electrical capacity or just it has a lot of, and we'll get into a lot of it today. But when I brought the idea of Bitcoin mining to this corporate company, it got tied up in red tape. No one gave me the time. It's a combination of like no one gave me the time of day, or it got tied up in red tape for over a year where it was like, okay, well, you guys clearly don't want to move or act on this, in a very serious way.
Sure.
When they could have benefited tremendously from having even just hosting facilities bolted on in ways to help monetize, when there was downtime, or if they had planned for future expansion of like manufacturing lines. So I'm getting a little long-winded, but I was asking because did you try talking internally at your company, like, hey, internally, maybe we should vertically integrate this?
I'll say yes. I was a part of initiating that dialogue up until the point where I called DPO and said I wanted to be a part of the team. And the next call that I made was to the other person involved with that activity. And I said, hey, I think I need to recuse myself from any further development of this because, and I shared, it was somebody that I was close enough to share that I had just called them and I'm in the process of negotiating an employment offer. Right. I might've been a little ahead of myself, right after the call with DPO, but I felt pretty good about it and it seemed like the right way for me to go. So for, I don't know, maybe it was more perceived conflict of interest than anything, I said I should probably back myself out of these discussions.
Sure. Yeah. And okay. So there wasn't a whole lot of appetite internally, and that's where you saw the opportunity was really with DPO.
I mean,
just to make sure that,
I don't know if there was appetite or not. It was like, I was one of the individuals that brought ideas forward. And this was one of, I don't know, 20, 30, 40, 50 ideas. I mean, there are requests for innovative solutions being presented all the time.
Okay.
And when I left the organization, it was all just very foundational, a couple people exploring an idea and talking about it. There wasn't any, commitment to do anything, or, I mean, it was barely on anybody's radar, and maybe that's still where it is with that company. But
okay,
it was very early on in the conversations of just saying, hey, here's this thing, and here's a different way of thinking about it, because everybody knows what Bitcoin is. Like they've at least heard of it.
Yep.
And the individual that I was working with was, we were talking together to say, how do we communicate this information differently internally? And again, it was very ground level, and maybe it stayed there. So
Oh, that's fascinating. And I appreciate going back on that. Again, my own experience, my own past experience with corporate America and the interest, it's you're pushing stuff uphill and you don't get a lot of traction. So I'd actually like to just maybe go back into your experience a little bit. You mentioned that you were working on some creative strategies for new business, and I would imagine some of that is you're looking for different types of off takers to come in. Um, what were you doing like traditionally to attract large off takers for the utility company?
Sure. Well, you hit on a couple topics. One is more of a how do we reflect on our strategy and think about it through different lenses to know if we have a good strategy long term, or how do we sensitize it with up and coming technologies. And the stuff I worked on as part of those strategy sessions were largely technology focused. DERMS, distributed energy resource management systems, is a hot term now, where utilities are looking at deploying infrastructure or helping their customers deploy infrastructure on the distribution system that is orchestrated through kind of a central command that they call a DERMS. And I'm not, the energy delivery expert. I probably don't even, I don't belong in that conversation, but that's some of the stuff where, hey, there's a bunch of technology that we can utilize differently today because the cost of data is so much cheaper, and the ability to get data and make decisions with software is so much quicker, and real-time market interaction with things out on the grid is now a real possibility where
Yeah.
it didn't used to be. So that's the type of stuff that the strategy teams would focus on. The other part of your question was more on the economic development side, and my experience is pretty much exclusively in regulated utility territory comes to attracting new load. So what I would observe is we would try and be a helpful community steward to have a site prospector get very familiar with the site very quickly and understand the landscape. We would facilitate, to the extent possible, some favorable tax treatment by connecting them with the individuals that might be able to make that happen.
Okay.
And on the utility side, it was more of a economic development rate product that we could offer and say, here's a discount that we can give you over some period of time. But again, even that was a rate regulated product. So in a utility rate case, there are debates over how to allocate cost and debates about what incentives are justified to attract new load. Tariffs are published, and your economic development team pretty much is stuck with how those were structured in the most recent rate case. There's some
And
flexibility, maybe in some cases,
sure.
more so than others, depending on which jurisdiction you're in. But for the most part, you're stuck with the rate structure that was approved in the rate case.
And and how long does it typically take to get a new rate case published? That's quite a long process, isn't it?
It can be a very long and laborious process for all stakeholders involved. I think it depends on the jurisdiction. There may be some where you are required to come in at least every so many years and file a rate case,
Mm,
or under certain circumstances you're required to come in and file a rate case. And then in other circumstances, the utility is the one that wants to do the rate case, because if your rate base is growing or your customer load demographics are changing, right? There are reasons why a utility will want to refile a rate case to get their rates adjusted.
sure. Yeah, I'd been told that those types of things take upwards to a year, if not longer, just to get things kind of in place. So I would imagine then, Eric, as I'm listening to like some of the traditional tactics to attracting more economic development for the grid for the power company, those are kind of tried and true. They've probably been in place for a very long time. There's really not a whole lot of, they're not very sexy, if you will. And then along comes Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, and they're coming to you with a large load, flexible load, and that they're aggressive on power rates. But walk me through, like, well, you kind of already did. You said the 5 minutes into hearing DPO's proposition, you jumped to the other side of the table.
Right.
But I have to imagine Bitcoin mining is just knocking the socks off of power companies, but there's a little bit of hesitation towards it still, right?
I think little is an understatement. Um, so it's a newer technology. I say newer because it's been around for a while, but in
Yeah.
terms of its deployment at this scale in the United States, it's still a pretty new technology.
Yes.
And regardless of what the technology is, utilities are going to be very careful about moving new technologies into their system for all the reasons I mentioned previously. You take that foundation and throw on top of it all the press you get around Bitcoin, and utility hesitation is higher than normal. So that all impedes forward progress, at least in a timely manner. So I don't know if I'm answering your question or if you wanted me to
You
go in a
are.
different
Yeah.
direction.
No, that's perfect. I because I am curious, I have these discussions. I mine Bitcoin myself. I see all the benefit, but then I do bump into resistance or friction, where there are things like large deposits or down payments required, or, you know, in some cases securing land and, paying out 2+ years for land leases and things like that. Like, they're
Yeah,
just,
you're
yeah.
speaking to the counterparty risk and the balance
Yes.
sheet risk that, I mean, regardless of who you are as a customer, that's going to cause utilities to respond appropriately. If you're asking for a 3-year, rate discount and a bunch of tax treatment, favorable tax treatment, and all these front end benefits paid for by the utilities, customer base, with this assurance that the customers that are funding this are going to get paid back and then some to make it worthwhile, and you ask, well, what's your balance sheet look like? What kind of counterparty risk am I stepping into? And in many cases, the response to those questions is a bit concerning, given how new
Oh,
this industry is and how the,
sure.
the money is coming to the table. And in some cases, and I guess that's where DPO differentiates itself a bit, is when we talk to energy asset owners, whether it's a utility or an independent power producer or somebody else, maybe it's a muni or a co-op or an industrial customer, our approach is those guys are fine that are buying a bunch of power, right? We don't have a
Yeah.
problem with that application. But try and think about this differently. Try and think about this as an energy asset that you utilize to improve the performance of your portfolio for your customer base. Think about this like a battery. Think about this as, DPO is an energy service provider. We're not a Bitcoin miner. We, to the same extent, a battery developer isn't a lithium company, right? They're providing an
Sure.
energy service with a technology that has a certain set of capabilities and cost profiles and a certain risk profile. And what DPO does is tries to help these energy companies understand this technology through the lens that they already look through. What can this do for you? How will it behave?
I
What kind
love
of
that.
risks
Yeah.
exist if your forecasts turn out to be different than what you used to move forward with your business case, right? All the common ways of thinking through an energy project. Let's look through things with that filter. And what we believe is, over time, some will move more quickly than others, but over time, energy companies are going to realize that this belongs in the portfolio. This is a very useful and quick to respond energy management resource. And the best example that I can give is to the untrained user. Let's say this is the first conversation I'm having with an energy company. The best comparison is, think of a battery, but instead of a 4-hour battery that charges during 4 cheap hours and discharges during 4 expensive hours, this battery, let's call it a value battery. This battery charges up to 24 hours a day and immediately discharges into a higher value market. So instead of 4 hours of arbitrage, I'm speaking about a 4 hour
Yeah.
battery storage system, which I think is the most common
Yep.
duration. Instead of arbitraging 4 hours each day over time, you're arbitraging 24 hours of energy every day across markets. So it's kind of like, think of it like you're building a transmission line into a new market. Your transmission line is IT infrastructure, but it's doing functionally, in a financial model, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference if you didn't have the labels on the cells. It's doing the same thing. It's arbitraging energy across markets.
It's phenomenal. And I really appreciate, because I was just about to ask you to go into who DPO is. So that was perfect. I appreciate the intro to who DPO is and the value that you bring. Um, you touched on something that I'd be curious to maybe double click on. You said they will eventually start to realize that this belongs in their portfolio. Do you mean belongs in their portfolio as something that they vertically integrate, or do you mean belongs in their portfolio as a customer or customer base that they need to be attracting,
Well, I
or
was
both?
specifically referring to the former, where this is
Okay.
vertically integrated the same way a wind asset is integrated. There are different forms of integration, right? But ultimately, coming back to that integrated resource plan that I was referring to earlier,
Yeah.
there are accepted technologies with generally accepted capabilities and cost profiles. Our view is this is going to be added to the list of technologies in the integrated resource plan for those models to choose from. And in some cases, it doesn't make sense to build this. You don't have the right conditions on your system for it to make sense to deploy it, for the same reasons you might not have the right conditions to deploy a battery or a natural gas facility or certain renewables, right? There are market conditions and there are utility specific conditions that cause technologies to be selected in those integrated resource plans. And no two IRPs are the same. You might see themes of technologies over time, right? There was back in the mid 2000s, there was a pretty heavy theme of environmental controls on coal plants. And because the alternative was shutting them down.
Mm-hmm.
And then we moved into a theme of natural gas combined cycle additions. And then we moved into a theme of wind resource additions. And then, I might be geographically narrow in my description of what happened chronologically, but you get the point that
Yeah.
there are themes of technologies that are generally consistent, but each utility's IRP is a little different. And I think over time, you're going to see this technology, while it might not be the predominant technology, you're going to see this technology show up in IRPs as one of those themes where, hey, it was the mid 2020s and the flexible data center technology started showing IRPs and getting selected pretty broadly. I think that's going to be the case. And maybe what makes it a little unique is you can right size these applications. You build a natural gas combined cycle
Yes.
facility, you don't
Yep.
have a whole lot of size options. It's big or bigger. And
Yeah.
with
Right.
this, it's, well, I don't know, maybe 2.5 megawatts makes sense over here, and 22 megawatts makes sense over there, and you can right size it and tailor it to address whatever the issues are that you're trying to address. Maybe it's wind curtailments. You have a couple wind resources that have rolled off of production tax credits, and they're curtailed very regularly in a market with negative LMPs all the time. We see that. We talk to
Mm-hmm.
wind asset owners weekly, and they're
Oh,
looking
wow.
for a home for this energy that isn't a terrible market. And again, aside from building a transmission line into a new market, which is going to be cost prohibitive always, um, this is the solution that functionally does the same thing. And in many cases,
It's
it's very economic.
Yeah. Well, and what I like about this and everything that you just laid out for us, Eric, is that, and you touched on this at the open of the episode, where your specialty, you specifically, you're very good at distilling down things that are normally BTUs and joules into dollars and P&L speak. What you're doing right now and what DPO is doing is bringing Bitcoin mining language to the power companies and explaining this to them in a way that's like helping shepherd and open up their minds to why they should be considering this.
It's kind of like expecting to go to a restaurant in a different country and order something off the menu when you don't speak the language, right? You're going to go in and
Yes,
you're not going to be able to
absolutely.
communicate. So engaging utilities constructively, or energy asset owners in general constructively, requires a bit of we'll call it preparation at a minimum, but hopefully it's more than that. Hopefully it's a long experience engaging with the players that are involved in deciding whether or not capital gets deployed or not.
Yeah. So I have to ask, when you're having these conversations and when DPO is having these conversations, is the focus more on revenue generation or like asset optimization? Is it like, do the companies gravitate more towards the revenue generation, or do they resonate more with like asset optimization and really getting the most utilization out of their generation
It
assets?
depends on who you're talking to. So if you are
Okay.
speaking with a large family office that has a bunch of energy infrastructure in the United States, and it's largely how do I get the biggest number on the top line? Uh, Utilities that have regulators they're answering to and customer advocacy groups are, especially rate regulated utilities. I, it's we almost need an entire podcast just to talk through how a rate regulated utility thinks about earnings, right? Because it's completely backwards. You kind of start with the answer, you have your rate of return that you're allowed to make on the capital that you invest, and you essentially back into everything else. That's not the best way of summarizing it, but essentially, if you get your project approved and you prudently spend the money, you get your rate of return.
Hmm.
Everything is looked through the customer's lens. It is looked at through the customer's lens. So if we're talking to a regulated utility, I'm not talking about IRR. I'm not talking about, EBITDA. I'm talking about present value revenue requirement impacts to your customer. And I'm talking about annual customer impacts to your customer. Are these front end loaded customer impacts or back end loaded customer impacts? How does that complement the rest of our system? And you're thinking through the lens of that industrial stakeholder group who's going to intervene and say, I'm affected in a way that I don't want to be affected by this. Or maybe they love it, right? If it's a good project in the right place. But you're going to have these stakeholders that come in and say, you're affecting this cost of service allocation, and you're affecting the fuel adjustment clause, and you're affecting, whatever the topic is that causes their stakeholders to be affected in some way. So that,
Yeah.
while we don't jump to that right away when engaging with utilities, that is certainly how it's being internalized. And you can talk past people very quickly if you're not recognizing the importance of regulatory engagement and looking through the lens of the customer.
Okay. Yeah, that's fascinating. And you know what? I might just take you up on a whole nother episode speaking to how regulated utilities, map out their earnings and then, conversely how that gets passed on to the customer. Because I believe it's if they earn more than they're they're allowed to, essentially, then those savings get passed on to the customer in the form of rate reductions, correct?
There are different ways in which that's handled in different jurisdictions, and depending on how much you over or under collect relative to what you were approved to collect in your rate case, it might be treated differently. But essentially, call it for round numbers, call it a 10% pre-tax cost of capital, and half of that is equity and half of that is debt, and the return on the equity portion is set in your rate case, right? That essentially says, well, if you have X amount of dollars of capital in rate base, we know exactly what our earnings are going to be absent these, small deviations from what was approved in the rate case.
It's fascinating. Like I said, I will probably take you up on that because I mean, that's not something that I think the average person gets a glimpse into. So that would be fascinating.
I'm not going to
Eric,
promise that
as
I'm the best
we're
person to do that, right? There are probably 1,000 people that can speak to
well,
that a lot better than me.
maybe we'll get you and someone else from the DPO team on. Perhaps we can explore that. I think that'd be great. But as we're kind of winding down the show to be respectful of time and watch the clock here, I do always like to kind of wrap up these conversations by getting some perspective on the utility companies that might not be taking this on immediately. What do you think is the biggest thing that they're missing, when either DPO or somebody else is approaching them for a Bitcoin mining project?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is experience. With any new technology, it takes time to learn how your stakeholders respond. It takes time to figure out how
Mm-hmm.
to integrate it into your energy market software. It takes time to figure out how costs and benefits are going to flow through a rate case. Um, it takes time to figure out how your community stakeholders are going to like or dislike the technology. I mean, take a look at wind, right? You have some landowner groups that are uh, so fiercely opposed to it that you can't build in certain communities, and you have other landowners that want as many towers on their property as they can get, right? So
Sure.
you learn things by doing it. And if you'd have 0 megawatts of this in your system, then you're behind the 8 ball on that learning curve. So that's the first thing that came to mind. The other is, I'll say, if it's a matter of selling power to a Bitcoin miner, from a dollars and cents perspective, you're probably not losing a whole lot, right? Because the Bitcoin miners are taking all the upside. There are very, very thin margins, absent some anomalies where power cost, the opportunity cost of power is extremely low. But for the
Yeah.
most part, there's not a whole lot of margin in the sale of electricity to these loads. All the upside is in converting that energy into a higher value market, like we were talking about earlier. And if utilities eventually get to that conclusion that they should be doing this, they might reflect back and say, gosh, why didn't we do this 3 years ago? We lost out on a ton of value for our customers, which maybe that's a true statement and realization for any new technology. You eventually figure it out and you start to deploy it and look
Sure.
back and say, gosh, I wish I knew about this earlier. So in that regard, it's probably no different, but the front end loaded value, when you're thinking about customer benefits or IRR, the front end loaded contribution to that business case is extraordinary. So it's different than waiting a couple of years to build a renewable asset when you have a lot of back end loaded benefits on a 30 to 40-year asset. These Bitcoin facilities are more like software or IT hardware rather, where they have maybe a
Yep.
4 to 5 year operating time, and then you go through a repower assessment. So you're packing a lot of dollars in the door on the front end of these projects that may make you reflect on not moving quickly with a little bit more regret than other technologies.
That I really appreciate that, because I actually had a conversation not that long ago with a gentleman at a utility company, and he shared with me exactly what you just said. He's like, Ben, the Bitcoin mining customer on my grid is just not a sexy proposition. He said my margins are not getting me out of bed all excited about this. So that's fascinating to hear that having this in their portfolio, but knowing that some of that resistance is coming from the big capital lift up front.
Yeah,
That's
but
awesome.
before
That's
we move off the topic, there's one other reason why having it in the portfolio is so crucial. It's because if it's in your portfolio and you're managing it like any other energy resource, where every single day you can decide, how am I going to offer this into the market tomorrow? How am I going to tweak my offer in the real time? You can't do that with a rate product. Remember that whole rate case process? You got all the interveners coming in and
yep,
you have to find
yep,
some middle
yep.
ground. Well, you're not going to optimize the performance of these assets through a rate case. You're going to do it by having it vertically integrated in your portfolio, developing a energy market strategy, deploying it, learning from it, making some tweaks, making it better. And you just can't do that with a rate case. So you're going to get a suboptimal outcome or a less than 100% value stack by selling power through, rate regulated mechanisms.
Yeah, and that right there is the reason I'm so excited for the next even just 5 years, for what we're going to see in the utility and electrical industry. Because I think that there's going to be some groups that catch on, and they may move past their testing phase in a pretty big way. It's going to be pretty cool to watch that happen. Hopefully I can be involved in some capacity.
Yeah, well, hey,
Whether facilitating conversations here or otherwise.
that's a big part of
That's
it.
fantastic.
Bringing people together to talk on a diverse set of topics. That's essential to educating your broader audience and helping people come together around this in a way that benefits everybody.
Yeah. So Eric, I always like to leave room for my guests to give a handoff to the audience. I want to make sure that people can get in touch with either yourself or DPO and your services. My audience is a mix of utility industry and Bitcoin mining industry. So would love to give you a second to, share with the audience how they can get in touch with you and DPO.
Sure. I think the best way to do that is probably to reach out to our general mailbox. And it's info, just info at digitalpoweroptimization.com. If you send something there within the day, usually somebody will get back to you. And I welcome any and all interested parties, whether you're an energy company, you are a customer of a large energy company, and you're interested in using this to optimize, your energy charges, maybe even we didn't even get into that topic, but if you have a lot of demand
I
charges that you
know.
don't like paying, you've got a low volumetric rate, like call us because we might have a solution for you. But yeah, just reach out to that info line and we'll be in touch.
Great. Eric, this was a blast. And there is very realistically another episode in our future, because you're right. We didn't get into a couple things that I'm also fascinated to talk through. So I really appreciate your time. This was great. You take
Thank you very
care.
much for having me on, Ben. All right, bye.